Sometimes the worst punishment from our family becomes the greatest blessing we never saw coming. Sometimes the person we're forced to be with is exactly the one our broken heart needed to heal. In ancient Norway, Viking warrior Bjarke the Thunderborn showed mercy to an enemy, and his own clan called him a traitor. His punishment was cruel: marry his half-sister Alva or be exiled forever from his homeland they hadn't spoken in 20 years. Their wedding was meant to shame them both. Everyone expected them to live in bitter silence, bound by duty but divided by resentment. Instead, two wounded souls found something neither expected in their harsh world: true understanding, forgiveness, and a bond deeper than blood itself. But how does a punishment meant to destroy two lives end up saving them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fjords of Vesterheim carved themselves deep into the Norwegian coast like scars left by ancient gods. Here, where the North Sea crashed against granite cliffs and pine forests stretched endlessly toward ice-capped peaks, the clan of the Thunderborn had ruled for 8 generations. Their longhouses stood proud against the bitter winds, smoke rising from hearth fires that had burned without cease for 300 winters. Bjarke Eriksson earned his name the day he first lifted Thunder's edge above his head. The battle axe had been forged by his great-grandfather from metal torn from a fallen star, its blade gleaming silver blue even in the dimmest light. When Bjarke was barely 16, already towering over grown men at nearly 7 feet tall, he had wielded the ancient weapon to defend their shores against Danish raiders. The sound of his war cry rolling across the battlefield like thunder had given him his name and his legend. Now, at 34, Bjarke's reputation stretched across 7 kingdoms. Ships would change course rather than face his longboat on the open sea. Enemy jarls spoke his name in whispers around their fires. His shoulders were broad as a mountain ledge, his arms thick as shipmasts, and his red-gold beard fell to his chest like a waterfall of flame. When he walked through the village, children stopped their games to stare, and even the clan elders stepped aside with respectful nods. But strength meant nothing without honor in Vesterheim. Honor was the invisible thread that bound their society together, stronger than iron chains and more precious than gold. It governed every aspect of their lives: how they fought, how they died, how they treated their enemies, and how they protected their own. The great hall of the Thunderborn clan could hold 200 warriors when the benches were full. Tonight it held barely 30, but their voices carried the weight of centuries. Elder Ragnar sat at the high table, his white beard braided with silver rings earned through 50 years of warfare. To his right sat Astrid the Wise, the only woman permitted to speak in clan judgment. Her weathered hands folded over a walking staff carved with protective runes. These elders remembered when Bjarke's father, Erik the Bold, had ruled with fierce pride, before the fever took him when Bjarke was barely 20. They remembered, too, the bitter divorce that had torn the family apart, when Erik's second wife, Ingrid, had fled to the mountain settlements with her young daughter. Claiming Erik's first wife had cursed their union. That daughter was Alva. In the 20 years since the family split, Alva had become something of a legend herself, though of a different sort entirely. While her half-brother earned fame through conquest, she had gained respect through healing. In her small stone dwelling high in the mountain passes, she tended to travelers, treated the sick, and studied the old ways that most had forgotten. Her collection of healing stones, each one carved with ancient runes and blessed by rituals passed down from the earliest settlers, could cure ailments that left other healers baffled. The mountain folk spoke of her kindness with reverence. She never turned away anyone in need, whether they came with silver coins or empty hands. Her knowledge of herbs and poultices rivaled that of the wisest medicine women in all of Norway. But she lived alone, unmarried at 31, keeping company only with her mentor Sini, an ancient woman who claimed to remember when the old gods still walked among mortals. Few in the village had seen Alva since she was 11 years old. They remembered a quiet child with dark hair and serious eyes, always trailing behind her mother with a leather satchel full of plants and stones. When Ingrid had taken her daughter away during that terrible winter of arguments and accusations, most assumed they would never return to the fjords. They had been wrong about the returning. Bjarke's closest friend, Erik Ironhand, named for his skill at the forge, not for any relation to Bjarke's father, often wondered aloud why his friend had never taken a wife. With Bjarke's reputation and wealth, he could have chosen from the finest women in 5 kingdoms. Daughters of jarls and kings would have considered it an honor to bear his children. Yet Bjarke had shown interest in none of them. A warrior's first bride is his sword, Bjarke would say when Erik pressed him about marriage. When I find a woman who can match Thunder's Edge for loyalty and strength, then I'll consider taking a wife. Erik would laugh at this, but privately he wondered if his friend was simply too lost in the legend of himself to see the loneliness that crept into his eyes during the long winter nights. The ancient laws that governed Viking society were complex and unforgiving. They had been carved into stone tablets by the first jarls, refined through generations of clan meetings and memorized by every child before they learned to swing a sword. Among the most sacred was the law of blood honor, the principle that a warrior's mercy toward enemies could only be shown under specific circumstances, and never without the consent of the clan. To spare an enemy's life without permission was considered not just cowardice, but betrayal of the highest order. It suggested that the warrior valued his own conscience over the safety of his people. It implied that he had gone soft, that he might hesitate in future battles when his clan needed him most. The punishment for such betrayal was severe, but offered a choice. The dishonored warrior could face permanent exile, stripped of name and property, forbidden from ever setting foot on clan lands again, or he could accept the judgment of bloodline. Marriage, a practice so old that most clans had forgotten it. Entirely, bloodline marriage was designed to ensure that a disgraced warrior's weakness would not spread beyond the family line. By marrying within his own blood, his shame would be contained. His children would bear the mark of his dishonor, and the clan would be protected from contamination by outsiders who might question the judgment. It was a cruel law, designed not just to punish but to humiliate. Most warriors chose exile rather than subject themselves and their kin to such disgrace. The wind howled through the rafters of the great hall as Elder Ragnar called for silence. Outside, snow began to fall in thick flakes that caught the firelight through the high windows. The season of storms was upon them, when the sea would freeze solid and no ships could come or go from their fjord. Whatever judgment was passed tonight would have to stand until spring. Astrid the Wise tapped her staff against the stone floor 3 times, the ancient signal that a formal clan judgment was about to begin. The warriors fell silent, their faces grave in the flickering torchlight. They all knew why they had gathered. Word of Bjarke's actions had spread quickly through the village, carried by the survivors of the battle who had witnessed his moment of mercy. In the shadows, near the great doors, Erik Ironhand watched his friend with growing concern. Bjarke sat with his massive hands folded on the table before him, his expression unreadable as carved stone. Thunder's Edge lay across his knees, its star-metal blade reflecting the firelight like captured lightning. The weapon that had made his legend might soon be all he had left. None of them knew that high in the mountain passes, a rider was already making her way down the treacherous winter paths toward the fjord. Alva had received the summons that afternoon, delivered by a young warrior who could barely meet her eyes as he explained what her half-brother had done. She had listened in silence, packed her healing stones into their worn leather pouch, and kissed her mentor Sinji goodbye. The runes spoke of this day long ago, Sinji had whispered, her ancient fingers tracing symbols in the air. What seems like an ending may be the truest beginning you'll ever know. Now, as Alva's horse picked its careful way down the icy slopes toward the lights of the village below, She tried to remember the last words she had spoken to Bjarke 20 years ago. They had been angry words, she recalled, bitter with the pain of a child who didn't understand why her family was being torn apart. She had blamed him for their father's favoritism, for the way Eric the Bold had always spoken of his son's destiny while treating her like an afterthought. The years had taught her wisdom about family wounds and the way they fester when left untended. She had learned to forgive her father, to understand her mother's choices, even to make peace with the isolation that had shaped her adult life. But she had never quite managed to forgive Bjarke for letting her go without a fight. Tonight, she might finally have the chance to tell him so. Whether either of them would survive the conversation was another matter entirely. The battle had begun at dawn, on the frozen shores of Kattegat, where King Magnus the Cruel had landed with 3 longships full of Danish warriors. They had come to settle an old blood debt. Magnus claimed that Bjarke's grandfather had stolen cattle from Danish lands 30 years prior, and honor demanded compensation in blood. Bjarke had met them with 40 of his finest warriors, their shields locked together like the scales of some great sea serpent. The clash of steel on steel rang across the ice as the two forces collided, breath steaming in the frigid air, blood spattering the snow in crimson arcs. For 3 hours they fought, neither side giving ground. Bjarke moved through the battle like a force of nature, Thunder's Edge singing through the air with deadly precision. The star-metal blade carved through Danish shields as if they were made of parchment, and his war cry shook icicles from the nearby cliffs. It was near the end, when the Danish line finally began to break, that Bjarke saw him. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, his blonde hair barely darkened by the first shadow of a beard. He wore fine mail that marked him as nobility, but his sword arm shook as he tried to fend off 2 of Bjarke's warriors. There was terror in his blue eyes, the kind of raw fear that comes when a young man first truly understands that he might die far from home. One of the Danish veterans shouted over the din of battle, "Protect Prince Olaf! Guard the king's son! King Magnus's heir, the boy who would one day rule the Danish territories if he lived to see another sunrise." Bjarke's warriors heard the shout too. They pressed forward with renewed fury, sensing the chance to end not just this battle, but the threat of future Danish raids. If they could kill or capture Magnus's only son, the old king would be forced to sue for peace. The boy, Prince Olaf, stumbled backward over the body of a fallen warrior. His sword flew from his grip, clattering across the ice. He landed hard on his back, staring up at the grey winter sky as Bjarke's shadow fell across him. Thunder's Edge rose above Bjarke's head, its blade catching the pale sunlight. One swift stroke would end the prince's life and secure victory for the Thunderborn clan. The boy closed his eyes and whispered what might have been a prayer, but in that moment Bjarke saw something else. Around the prince's neck hung a simple pendant, not gold or silver, but carved wood in the shape of a raven. It was crude work, clearly made by young hands, and it looked exactly like the one Bjarke had carved for his own father when he was barely 8 years old. The boy was someone's son. Someone had taught him to hold a sword, to braid his hair in the warrior's knot, to wear his father's colors with pride. Someone was waiting for him to come home. Bjarke's arm froze mid-swing. "Yield," he said instead, his voice carrying over the sounds of dying battle. Prince Olaf opened his eyes, confusion replacing terror. "What?" I said. "Yield. Surrender and I'll spare your life." The boy's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice. "I yield. I surrender to Bjarke the Thunderborn." Around them, the remaining Danish warriors threw down their weapons. The battle was over, but Bjarke's troubles were just beginning. Eric Ironhand was the first to reach his side, blood from a shallow cut running down his cheek. His eyes were wide with disbelief as he stared at the unharmed prince. "Bjarke, what are you doing? Kill him now while we have the chance." I gave him quarter. "He surrendered. He's the enemy. Magnus's heir!" Eric's voice carried farther than he intended, and other warriors began to gather around them. "If we let him live, he'll just return with more ships next season." Bjarke helped the young prince to his feet, steadying him with one massive hand. Up close, he could see that the boy was trembling, not just from cold, but from the shock of facing death and finding mercy instead. "What's your name, lad?" Bjarke asked gently. "Olaf Magnusson, Prince of the Danes," the boy replied, trying to summon dignity despite his chattering teeth. "Well, Olaf Magnusson, you fought bravely today. Your father should be proud." The prince's chin lifted slightly. "Will you ransom me?" "No, I'm setting you free." The murmurs from Bjarke's warriors grew louder, more agitated. This was not how victories were supposed to end. Enemy princes were valuable prisoners to be held for gold or political advantage. They were not supposed to be released with nothing more than a pat on the shoulder. "Bjarke," Eric said urgently, "think about what you're doing. The clan will never understand. The clan will understand that I showed mercy to a brave young warrior who reminded me of myself at his age." Bjarke's voice carried the tone of finality that his men knew better than to argue with. Help him gather his father's dead. They deserve proper rights. As Prince Olaf walked away across the bloody snow, flanked by the few surviving Danish warriors, he turned back once. The pendant around his neck caught the light as he pressed his hand to his heart in a gesture of respect. "I won't forget this, Bjarke the Thunderborn. The debt of my life belongs to you." Then he was gone, disappearing into the forest that bordered the shoreline. The ride back to Vesterheim was the longest of Bjarke's life. His warriors spoke in hushed tones behind him, their voices carrying the weight of disappointment and confusion. He had won the battle decisively, proven once again that the Thunderborn clan was not to be trifled with. But instead of celebration, there was unease in their ranks. Eric rode beside him in troubled silence until finally he could contain himself no longer. "Why?" he asked simply. Bjarke was quiet for so long that Eric wondered if he had heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, distant. "When I was 16, I challenged a man twice my age to single combat because he had insulted our family's honor. I was brave and stupid and very lucky to survive. If someone had shown me mercy that day, if they had seen past my pride to the frightened boy underneath, it might have saved me years of thinking that strength was the only thing that mattered. That boy will grow up to be our enemy, maybe, or maybe he'll remember that enemies can also show honor." But by the time they reached the village, word of Bjarke's mercy had already spread. The survivors of previous battles had carried the tale, and it had grown in the telling. Some whispered that Bjarke had gone soft, that his legendary ferocity was fading. Others suggested that the Danish prince had bewitched him somehow, used some form of sorcery to cloud his judgment. Elder Ragnar was waiting in the great hall when Bjarke arrived, his weathered face grim with disapproval. Astrid the Wise sat beside him, her fingers tracing patterns on her staff that Bjarke recognized as protective runes. "Sit," Ragnar commanded. Bjarke took his place at the long table, Thunder's Edge across his knees as always. Around them, the hall filled with clan members who had heard the news. Their faces showed a mixture of confusion, disappointment, and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "Tell me what happened," Ragnar said. Bjarke recounted the battle truthfully, leaving out nothing. When he finished, the hall was silent except for the crackling of the hearth fire. "You violated the ancient ways," Astrid said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "Mercy without clan consent is betrayal of the highest order. I followed my conscience. Your conscience does not speak for this clan." Ragnar's fist slammed against the table. "What if that boy returns with an army? What if your moment of weakness costs us everything we have built? Then I will face that consequence when it comes. You will face consequences now." Ragnar stood, his full authority filling the hall. "By the ancient laws, you have dishonored this clan. The punishment is exile or bloodline marriage. Choose." Bjarke felt the weight of every eye in the hall upon him. These people had followed him into battle, trusted him with their lives, looked to him for leadership. Now they stared at him like a stranger. "I choose bloodline marriage." The words fell into silence, like stones into deep water. "There is only one eligible match," Astrid said quietly. "Your half-sister Alva. A messenger has already been sent to summon her. Outside, the wind howled through the rafters, and Bjarke closed his eyes, wondering what price his moment of mercy would ultimately demand. Alva arrived at dawn, her horse's hooves echoing against the frozen ground as she rode into the village square. 20 years had transformed the gangly girl into a woman of quiet strength, her dark hair braided with small bones and feathers in the old style. She wore travel-stained leathers and a cloak lined with wolf fur, practical garments that spoke of a life lived close to nature's harsh realities. The few villagers brave enough to venture out in the early morning cold stopped their tasks to stare. Most had forgotten what Eric the Bold's second daughter looked like. They saw a woman who moved with careful grace, her green eyes taking in every detail of the village she had once called home. Her face was weathered by mountain winds, but unlined by the bitterness that often marked those who lived in isolation. At her side hung a leather pouch that clinked softly. With each step, her collection of healing stones, each one carved with protective runes and blessed by rituals older than memory. The largest stone, a piece of black obsidian shot through with silver veins, had been passed down through 5 generations of wise women. It was said to reveal truth through deception and heal wounds that went deeper than flesh. She dismounted at the great hall's entrance and stood for a long moment, gathering herself before she pushed open the heavy oak doors. The interior hadn't changed. The same carved pillars, the same tapestries depicting ancestral victories, the same long tables scarred by countless meals and meetings. But it felt smaller somehow, as if the years had shrunk the spaces of her childhood. Bjarke was waiting for her. He sat alone at the high table, a cup of ale growing warm in his massive hands. Thunder's edge rested against the wall behind him, its star-metal blade catching the morning light that streamed through the high windows. When he looked up at her approach, she saw surprise flicker across his features, as if he had expected the child who left to walk back through those doors. "Sister," he said quietly. "Brother." Her voice was steady, but he caught the slight hesitation before the word. They studied each other across 20 years of silence. He had grown even larger since their childhood, his shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, his red-gold beard now streaked with silver at the temples. But his eyes were the same, grey as storm clouds, holding depths that few people ever saw. She had changed more dramatically. The serious child had become a woman of obvious capability, her hands marked by the calluses of practical work, her bearing that of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions alone. There was a stillness about her that spoke of long hours spent in meditation and contemplation. "You came," he said. "Did you think I wouldn't?" He considered this. "I wasn't certain. You've made a good life in the mountains. This will destroy all of that, perhaps." She settled into a chair across from him, her movements economical and precise. "Or perhaps this is where my path was always meant to lead. You speak like Sinyi now, all riddles and prophecy. Sinyi taught me that the future reveals itself in its own time, not when we demand to see it." Alva pulled her healing pouch closer, her fingers tracing the familiar shapes of the stones inside. "She also taught me that running from family wounds only makes them fester." The accusation in her words was gentle but unmistakable. Bjarke winced slightly. "I never stopped you from visiting. You never asked me to either." The silence stretched between them, heavy with old hurts and unspoken grievances. Finally, Bjarke pushed his ale away and leaned forward. "I need you to understand something, Alva. This marriage, it's meant to be a punishment for both of us. The clan expects us to live in shame, to bear the weight of my dishonor together. They think it will be a kind of living death. And you, what do you think it will be?" "I don't know." His honesty surprised them both. "I remember you as a child who collected injured birds and scolded me for pulling the wings off insects. I remember that you could make our father smile even when his anger was burning everything else around him. But I don't know who you became after you left." Alva reached into her pouch and withdrew one of her healing stones, a piece of smooth river rock carved with interlocking spirals. She placed it on the table between them, where it caught the light like captured moonbeams. "This stone came from the stream where we used to catch fish when we were children," she said. "Do you remember? You would wade in with your hands and somehow manage to catch them bare-handed while I sat on the bank and laughed." He stared at the stone, and she saw the moment when memory overtook him. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You always threw yours back. Said they looked too sad to eat. I still do that." She picked up the stone and turned it over in her palm. Some things about a person never change, no matter how many years pass. The heart remembers what the mind tries to forget. What else does your heart remember? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with 20 years of separation and hurt. Alva was quiet for a long moment, her fingers continuing to turn the stone over and over. "I remember that you used to have nightmares after battles. You'd wake up shouting orders, trying to save men who were already dead. I remember that you carved wooden animals for me when I was sick, and that you once fought 3 older boys because they said our mother was a witch." "She wasn't a witch," Bjarke said quietly. "No, she was just a woman trying to hold together a family that was coming apart at the seams. And you were just a boy carrying too much responsibility too soon." The understanding in her voice was almost his undoing. For 20 years, he had carried the weight of their family's collapse, believing himself somehow responsible for the bitterness that had driven Ingrid and Alva away. To hear absolution in his sister's voice was a gift he hadn't dared hope for. "The ceremony is tomorrow," he said. "Elder Ragnar wants it done quickly, before the worst of the winter storms arrive." "I know. Signy prepared me." Alva returned the stone to her pouch and stood. "She also gave me something for you." She reached into her cloak and withdrew a small wooden carving, a raven, its wings spread in flight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each feather etched with delicate precision. She said you would understand its meaning when the time was right. Bjarke took the carving, turning it over in his massive hands with surprising gentleness. Ravens were Odin's messengers, symbols of wisdom and memory. They also represented the connection between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. "Where will you stay tonight?" he asked. "Astrid the Wise offered me a place by her fire. She wants to perform the traditional pre-marriage blessings." Alva moved toward the door, then paused. "Bjarke, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever this union becomes, I want you to know something. I never blamed you for the way our family fell apart. Children always think they have more power to fix things than they actually do." After she left, Bjarke sat alone with the wooden raven, wondering if forgiveness could really be as simple as she made it sound. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall in earnest, covering the village in a blanket of white that would not lift until spring. The marriage ceremony took place at noon in the great hall, witnessed by a gathering that felt more like a funeral than a celebration. The clan members sat in stony silence as Elder Ragnar performed the ancient rites, his voice echoing off the wooden beams like pronouncements of doom. There were no flowers, no feast, no joyous toasts, only the cold fulfillment of justice according to the old laws. Alva wore her finest dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the green in her eyes, but it was borrowed from Astrid and smelled of herbs and old memories. Bjarke stood beside her in his ceremonial armor, Thunder's Edge at his side as tradition demanded. But he looked like a man preparing for battle rather than a bridegroom claiming his bride. When Ragnar asked for the traditional vows, their words were spoken quietly, without warmth or conviction. They were going through the motions of a sacred ritual that had been twisted into punishment. And everyone present felt the wrongness of it, by Thor's hammer and Odin's wisdom. "You are bound," Ragnar intoned, as he wrapped their joined hands with a braided cord. "What the gods have joined, let no man put asunder. What blood has claimed, let honor preserve." The cord was made of horsehair and leather, dyed red with berries, a marriage bond that would not break easily. As it tightened around their wrists, Alva felt the weight of finality settle over them both. Whatever they had been to each other before, they were husband and wife now, bound by law and custom until death. The feast afterward was a subdued affair. Most clan members made their excuses and departed early, uncomfortable with the atmosphere of forced celebration. Those who remained ate in relative silence, shooting glances at the high table where the newly married couple sat side by side, neither touching their food. Eric Ironhand, loyal to the end, tried to lighten the mood with stories of past victories and shared adventures. But even his usually infectious laughter fell flat in the oppressive quiet. Finally, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, he raised his cup in what everyone knew would be the only toast of the day. "To Bjarke and Alva," he said, his voice carrying farther than he intended. "May you find peace in each other's company, and may the gods grant you wisdom in the days to come." It was the most diplomatic blessing he could manage under the circumstances. The few remaining guests murmured their agreement and drank, then began making their own departures into the gathering dusk. As the hall emptied, Bjarke and Alva found themselves alone, except for the servants clearing the tables. The weight of their new situation settled around them like a heavy cloak. "I've prepared the small house behind the forge for us," Bjarke said finally. "It's private and the walls are thick. You won't be disturbed by clan business." Alva nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. The small house was traditionally used for guests or newly married couples who needed space away from the main family compound. It would allow them to maintain the appearance of a proper marriage while giving them both room to breathe. "Thank you for thinking of that." They walked through the village in silence, past houses where warm light glowed in windows, and families gathered for their evening meals. Children peered at them from doorways, their eyes wide with curiosity about the strange marriage that everyone was talking about in whispers. Alva pulled her cloak closer, feeling the weight of their stares. The small house was larger than her mountain dwelling, but somehow felt more confining. It had been furnished hastily with cast-off pieces from various households. A narrow bed, a single chair, a table scarred by years of use, and a hearth that drew poorly. Someone had tried to make it welcoming by hanging dried herbs from the rafters and placing a bowl of winter apples on the table. But the gesture only emphasized how unwelcoming the situation truly was. Bjarke set Thunder's edge against the wall near the door and immediately looked uncomfortable in the confined space. His massive frame seemed to fill the entire room, making every movement feel awkward and intrusive. "I can sleep by the fire," he offered. "The bed is yours." Alva studied his face in the flickering firelight. There was resignation there and sadness, but also something else, a careful consideration that suggested he was trying to make the best of an impossible situation. "We're married now," she said quietly. "The clan will expect us to share a bed, whether we want to or not. If we don't maintain at least the appearance of a proper union, it will reflect poorly on both our families. I won't force." "I know you won't." She moved to the small window and looked out at the snow falling more heavily now. "But we need to be practical about this, Bjarke. We're going to be living together for the rest of our lives. We might as well figure out how to do it with some dignity." He joined her at the window, careful to maintain distance between them. In the yard behind the forge, Eric's apprentices were banking the fires for the night, their movements creating dancing shadows against the buildings. "What do you suggest?" "We start by being honest with each other. About what we want, what we need, what we're afraid of." She turned to face him. "I'm afraid that I'll disappear in the shadow of your legend, that people will see me only as the sister wife who helped drag down Bjarke the Thunderborn." Her candor surprised him. He had expected awkwardness, perhaps resentment, but not this direct confrontation with their reality. "And I'm afraid that my dishonor will destroy any chance you had for happiness," he admitted. "You could have had a good marriage, children, a normal life. Instead, you're trapped with me in this." He gestured around the small room. "This what? This chance to finally understand each other again?" The question hung in the air between them. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the shutters and sending snow swirling against the glass. Inside, the fire crackled and settled, casting new patterns of light and shadow across their faces. "Tell me about your life in the mountains," Bjarke said. "I want to understand who you became after you left here." So she did. As they sat on opposite sides of the hearth, she told him about her years of training with Sinji, about learning to read the old runes and mix healing potions. She spoke of lonely winters when the mountain passes were blocked for months, of spring mornings when she could see eagles soaring over the peaks, of the satisfaction that came from healing someone who had given up hope. In return, he told her about the battles that had made his reputation, but also about the doubts that kept him awake at night. He spoke of the weight of leadership, of making decisions that could cost men their lives, of the loneliness that came with being feared more than loved. As the night deepened around them, they began to rediscover the connection that had been buried under 20 years of separation and hurt. They were different people now, shaped by experiences the other couldn't fully understand, but the foundation of trust they had built as children was still there, waiting to be rebuilt. 3 weeks into their marriage, the first real test came in the form of Magnus Ironleg, a visiting jarl from the southern settlements who had heard rumors of Bjarke's disgrace. He arrived on a cold morning with a dozen warriors and a swagger that immediately put the entire village on edge. Magnus was everything Bjarke was not. Lean, where Bjarke was massive. Silver-tongued, where Bjarke was direct, quick to smile and quicker to find insult. He wore his wealth openly, with gold arm rings and a sword pommel studded with garnets. His reputation was built more on cunning than courage, and he had come to Vesterheim with a specific purpose. Bjarke the Thunderborn, he called out as he dismounted in the village square, his voice carrying an undertone of mockery. I've traveled far to see the great warrior who has finally been tamed by marriage. Bjarke emerged from the forge, where he had been helping Eric repair a broken plough blade. His hands were still black with soot, his leather apron marked by sparks, but his presence filled the square like a gathering storm. The villagers, who had been going about their morning tasks, stopped to watch, sensing the potential for violence in the air. Magnus Ironleg, Bjarke said evenly. What brings you to our fjord in the dead of winter? Trade negotiations, of course, but I confess I'm curious about these stories I've been hearing. They say you spared an enemy's life and were forced to marry your own sister as punishment. They say the great Bjarke has grown soft in his old age. The insult was deliberate and carefully chosen. In Viking culture, questioning a man's courage was tantamount to a challenge to single combat. Magnus was testing whether Bjarke would rise to the bait, and whether his marriage had indeed weakened him, as the rumors suggested. From the doorway of their small house, Alva watched the confrontation unfold. She had been grinding herbs for a poultice when Magnus's arrival disrupted the quiet morning. And now she stood with her mortar and pestle still in her hands, reading the dangerous currents flowing between the two men. Careful with your words. Magnus, Bjarke said, his voice carrying a warning. You're a guest in my hall, but even guests can wear out their welcome. Magnus laughed, a sound like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Your hall? I thought it belonged to your clan elders now. After all, a man who can't be trusted to show proper mercy to enemies surely can't be trusted to lead his people. The watching villagers drew back slightly, sensing that violence was becoming inevitable. Eric Ironhand appeared at Bjarke's shoulder, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. Other warriors began emerging from buildings around the square, their loyalties clear despite their disapproval of Bjarke's recent choices. But before anyone could draw steel, Alva stepped forward. Magnus Ironleg, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. I'm Alva, wife of Bjarke the Thunderborn. You speak of mercy as if it were weakness, but I wonder, have you ever been strong enough to show it? Magnus turned to her with surprise, clearly not expecting to be challenged by a woman. His eyes took in her simple dress, her herb-stained apron, her unadorned hair, and his expression shifted to something approaching contempt. The sister-wife speaks, he said, his tone deliberately insulting. Tell me, woman, how does it feel to be married to a man whose own clan considers him dishonored? The square fell absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as everyone waited to see how she would respond to such a public humiliation. Alva set down her mortar and pestle with deliberate care, then walked forward until she stood directly in front of Magnus. She was a full head shorter than the visiting Jarl, but something in her bearing made her seem larger, more formidable. "You mistake dishonor for growth," she said quietly. "A man who learns to balance justice with compassion becomes more dangerous, not less. A warrior who understands when to stay his hand is more fearsome than one who kills without thought." She reached into the leather pouch at her side and withdrew her largest healing stone, the black obsidian shot, through with silver veins that had belonged to her grandmother. She held it up so that it caught the pale winter light, its surface gleaming like captured starlight. "This stone has been passed down through 5 generations of wise women," she continued. "It reveals truth through deception, shows what is real beneath what appears to be. Would you like to know what it shows me when I look at you, Magnus Ironleg?" There was something in her voice now, a quality that made Magnus take an involuntary step backward. The stone seemed to pulse with inner light, and for a moment, everyone in the square felt the presence of something older and more powerful than human ambition. "I see a man who mistakes cruelty for strength," Alva said, her words falling into the silence like drops of ice water. "I see someone who has never faced a choice between what is easy and what is right. I see a soul so small that it cannot comprehend mercy because it has never been worthy of receiving it." Magnus's face flushed red with anger and humiliation. His hand moved toward his sword, but before he could draw it, Bjarke's massive hand clamped down on his wrist with crushing force. "My wife has spoken truly," Bjarke said, his voice deadly quiet. "But she has also shown you more courtesy than you deserve. If you draw steel in my village square, you'll answer to me personally." For a long moment, the two men stood locked in a contest of wills. Magnus was strong and skilled, but he was also vastly outmatched. Slowly, reluctantly, he released his grip on his sword. "This isn't finished," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Yes, it is," Bjarke replied. "You came here to test whether I had grown weak. Instead, you've learned that I have grown wise. Take that knowledge back to the southern settlements with you." Magnus mounted his horse and rode out of the village without another word, his warriors trailing behind him in uncomfortable silence. The watching villagers began to disperse, but Bjarke noticed that their glances toward him and Alva had changed. There was something new in their expressions, not the hero worship he was used to, but something deeper and more valuable, respect. That evening, as they sat by their fire, sharing a simple meal of bread and stew, Bjarke found himself studying his wife with new appreciation. "Where did that come from?" he asked. "That power you showed in the square?" Alva turned the obsidian stone over in her palm, watching the firelight play across its surface. "Sini taught me that true strength isn't about making others fear you. It's about making them see themselves clearly." Magnus came here expecting to find a broken man and his shamed wife. Instead, he found 2 people who had learned to support each other. "Is that what we're doing? Supporting each other?" She looked up at him, and in her green eyes he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Not romantic love, that would have been impossible so soon, but genuine affection, the kind that grows between 2 people who have chosen to trust each other despite their circumstances. "We're becoming a family again," she said simply. "Not the one we were born into, but the one we're choosing to create." Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside their small house, warmth was beginning to grow. Winter deepened around Vesterheim like a clenched fist, bringing with it the long nights and bitter cold that tested every soul in the settlement. It was during these dark months that Bjarke and Alva truly began to discover each other. Not as the children they had once been, but as the adults they had become. The revelation came gradually, in moments both small and significant. Alva noticed how Bjarke would wake in the depths of night, his body rigid with tension, from dreams he couldn't quite remember. Without being asked, she began brewing him a tea made from valerian root and chamomile, herbs that brought peaceful sleep. He never commented on the nightly ritual, but she saw the gratitude in his eyes as he accepted the warm cup from her hands. In return, Bjarke observed how Alva would sometimes stand at their small window for long minutes, staring out at the mountain peaks visible in the distance. He recognized the look of homesickness, the pull of a life left behind. So he began taking her on walks through the forest paths that wound up toward the higher elevations, giving her glimpses of the wild places that fed her soul. It was on one such walk that they discovered the old shrine, hidden in a grove of ancient pines. Half buried under decades of fallen needles and overgrown with moss, stood a stone altar dedicated to Freya, god of fertility and prosperity. Someone had carved intricate symbols into its surface, spirals and knots that seemed to shift and move in the dappled sunlight filtering through the branches. "I remember this place," Alva said softly, brushing snow and debris from the carved symbols. "Mother brought me here once when I was very young. She said it was where our ancestors came to ask the gods for guidance in times of trouble." Bjarke studied the carvings with the eye of a warrior accustomed to reading omens and signs. "These symbols are older than our settlement, probably older than the first longships that brought our people to these shores." Alva ran her fingers along one of the spiral patterns, and for a moment, both of them could have sworn they felt warmth radiating from the ancient stone. Sini always said that some places hold memory the way trees hold rings of growth. The prayers and hopes of generations soaked into the very rock. They began visiting the shrine regularly. Not to pray, neither was particularly devout, but to sit in comfortable silence and think about their lives. The grove became a neutral space where they could speak honestly about their fears and hopes without the weight of clan expectations pressing down on them. It was there that Alva first told him about the loneliness that had defined her adult years. "I thought I was content in the mountains," she said one afternoon, as snow began to fall through the pine boughs. "I had my work, my studies, the people who came to me for healing. But there were nights when the silence felt so complete that I wondered if I had simply disappeared from the world. You never wanted a family of your own. I wanted a family that wanted me back." The admission was quiet, almost lost in the whisper of wind through the trees. "After what happened with our parents, after the way the divorce tore everything apart, I was afraid that love was just another word for the kind of pain that destroys everything it touches." Bjarke was quiet for a long time, considering her words. Finally, he spoke. "I never married because I was afraid I was already too much like our father. Eric the Bold was a great warrior, but he was also a man who couldn't see past his own needs long enough to understand what his choices cost the people around him. I didn't want to inflict that kind of damage on someone I cared about. And now I'm beginning to think that maybe we've been given a chance to prove that we're different from him, that we can choose to build something instead of tearing it down." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. They began to share more than just space and daily routines. They began to share themselves. Alva taught Bjarke about the healing arts, showing him how to identify medicinal plants and mix simple remedies. He was surprisingly gentle for such a large man, his massive hands capable of delicate work when the situation required it. In return, Bjarke began teaching her the warrior's skills their father had never bothered to pass along. He showed her how to hold a sword properly, how to read the intentions of potential enemies, how to carry herself with the confidence that would make aggressors think twice about targeting her. "Why are you teaching me this?" she asked one evening as they practiced basic defensive stances in their small yard. "Because knowledge is power, and I want you to be powerful." He adjusted her grip on the practice sword, his hands gentle but firm. "In this world, being able to defend yourself isn't just practical, it's necessary for true freedom." Their physical proximity during these lessons began to create a different kind of awareness between them. Not the romantic attraction that might have developed between unrelated people, but something deeper and more complex. A recognition of shared strength, mutual respect, and growing affection that defied easy categorization. The village began to notice the change in them both. Alva was spending more time in the settlement proper, offering her healing services to anyone who needed them. Her gentle manner and obvious skill quickly earned her a place in the community that had nothing to do with her marriage to Bjarke. People began seeking her out, not just for physical ailments, but for the kind of wise counsel that came from years of solitary reflection. Bjarke, meanwhile, seemed to have found a new equilibrium. He was still the fierce warrior his people depended on for protection, but there was a thoughtfulness to his decisions now that hadn't been there before. He listened more carefully in clan meetings, considered multiple perspectives before acting, and showed a patience with younger warriors that surprised everyone who knew his reputation. Eric Ironhand was the first to comment on the transformation. "You're different," he said one day as they worked together in the forge, repairing weapons damaged in a recent skirmish with raiders. Calmer, more settled. "Marriage will do that to a man," Bjarke replied. But there was something in his tone that suggested he was as surprised by the changes as anyone else. "This isn't what any of us expected when the sentence was pronounced." "No," Bjarke agreed. "It isn't." That night, as he and Alva sat by their fire, sharing the day's events, he found himself wondering if the clan elders had somehow known this would happen. If their punishment had actually been a gift disguised as justice. A way of forcing two damaged souls to heal each other. But when he looked at his wife, and the word no longer felt strange in his mind, he realized it didn't matter what their intentions had been. What mattered was what he and Alva chose to make of the life they had been given together. And for the first time in years, Bjarke the Thunderborn was genuinely happy. The messenger arrived on the first day of spring, when the ice was beginning to break up in the fjord, and the earliest wildflowers were pushing through the last patches of snow. He was young, barely more than a boy, and his horse was lathered with sweat despite the cool morning air. The urgency of his mission was written in every line of his travel-stained body. Bjarke was in the great hall, discussing the season's planting schedules with the village elders, when the messenger burst through the doors. The boy's eyes were wide with exhaustion and fear, and his first words sent a chill through everyone present. "Bjarke the Thunderborn, I bring word from Prince Olaf Magnusson of the Danes." The hall fell silent. Every man present remembered the battle where Bjarke had spared the young prince's life, the act of mercy that had led to his forced marriage and disgrace. Now, months later, that decision was reaching back to touch their lives once more. Bjarke rose from his seat, Thunder's edge at his side as always. "Speak, boy. What word does the prince send?" The messenger fumbled in his leather satchel and withdrew a scroll sealed with blue wax, the royal seal of the Danish court. His hands shook as he held it out to Bjarke. "He begs you to come to Hedeby with all speed, my lord. King Magnus the Cruel has fallen gravely ill, and there are those who would see Prince Olaf dead before he can claim his father's throne. The prince says," the boy's voice cracked with exhaustion, "he says that only the man who showed him mercy when he deserved death can be trusted to help him claim what is rightfully his." Elder Ragnar's face darkened with anger. "This is the consequence of your weakness, Bjarke. The boy seeks to drag us into Danish politics, to make us pawns in his struggle for power." But Bjarke was already breaking the wax seal, his eyes scanning the contents of the scroll. As he read, his expression grew increasingly troubled. Finally, he looked up at the assembled clan members. "There's more to this than a simple request for aid," he said quietly. "Prince Olaf writes that his father's advisors have discovered our family connection to the Danish royal line. They plan to use it against him." A murmur of confusion ran through the hall. Astrid the Wise leaned forward on her staff, her ancient eyes sharp with interest. "What family connection?" "We have no ties to the Danish throne." Bjarke's jaw tightened as he read directly from the scroll. "According to this, our grandmother Solveig was sister to King Magnus's grandfather. She fled to Norway after a failed coup attempt, changed her name, and married into our clan to hide her identity. If this is true, then Prince Olaf and I are cousins. And my marriage to Alva." He stopped, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. Your marriage to Alva makes you both legitimate claimants to the Danish throne, Astrid finished, her voice filled with dawning horror. The bloodline marriage that was meant to contain your dishonor has instead given you a claim to royal power. The hall erupted in chaos as the clan members began shouting questions and accusations. Some demanded to know how such vital information about their ancestry had been kept secret. Others insisted that Bjarke was lying, that this was some elaborate scheme to escape the consequences of his earlier actions. But Bjarke was no longer listening to their arguments. His mind was racing through the implications of this revelation, understanding with sickening clarity how it would change everything. If Prince Olaf's information was accurate, then the forced marriage that had been intended as punishment had accidentally created one of the most dangerous political situations in Scandinavia. Two legitimate heirs to the Danish throne, united by marriage and backed by one of the most feared warrior clans in Norway, represented a threat that King Magnus's advisors could never allow to survive. "We need to find Alva," he said, cutting through the shouting with the voice of command that had carried him through 100 battles. "If this information is true, then her life is in as much danger as mine." But when they searched the village, Alva was nowhere to be found. Her healing stones were gone from their usual place by the hearth, and the small bag she used for gathering herbs was missing from its peg by the door. A quick check of the stable showed that her horse was also gone. Eric Ironhand found the first clue: footprints in the soft earth near the forest path that led to the ancient shrine. The tracks showed that Alva had left on foot, walking quickly but not running. Whatever had prompted her departure, it hadn't been panic. They found her at the stone altar, sitting in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the pine boughs. Her healing stones were arranged in a complex pattern around the carved symbols, and she was holding the black obsidian piece in both hands, staring into its silver-veined depths as if it contained all the answers she needed. "You already know," Bjarke said as he approached. "It wasn't a question. Sinji told me before I left the mountains," she replied, without looking up. "She said the runes had revealed that our marriage would either save 2 kingdoms or destroy them both. I thought she was speaking in riddles the way she always did. I never imagined she meant it literally." Bjarke sat beside her on the moss-covered stone, careful not to disturb her arrangement of healing stones. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I hoped she was wrong. Because I wanted what we were building together to be real, not just another move in some cosmic game of politics and power." She finally looked up at him, and he saw tears in her green eyes. "I wanted us to have a chance to be happy before the world decided we were too dangerous to live. We still have that chance, do we? Look at what's happening, Bjarke. A Danish messenger arrives with news that makes us both targets for assassination. How long before Magnus Ironleg returns with a larger force? How long before other Jarls decide that removing us would be safer than allowing us to live?" The truth of her words settled over them like a cold fog. Their marriage, which had begun as punishment and grown into something precious, had now become a weapon that others would seek to control or destroy. "There's something else," Alva said quietly. "Something Sinji made me promise to tell you if this day ever came." She reached into her leather pouch and withdrew an object that made Bjarke's breath catch in his throat. It was a ring, not gold or silver, but carved from a single piece of jet-black stone. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with tiny runes etched around the band that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "This belonged to our grandmother Solveig," Alva said. "Sinji has been keeping it safe for 70 years, waiting for the right time to return it to the family. She said it would help us understand our true heritage when the moment came." Bjarke took the ring with trembling hands. The moment it touched his skin, images flashed through his mind. Visions of a proud woman fleeing across dark waters, of secret marriages and hidden identities, of choices made in desperation that would echo through generations. "We're not just cousins to Prince Olaf," he said, understanding flooding through him. "Our grandmother was the rightful queen of the Danes. She was cheated out of her throne by her brother's treachery, which means that technically We have a better claim to the Danish crown than Olaf does." They sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what they had discovered. Their punishment marriage had revealed itself to be something far more complex and dangerous, a restoration of royal bloodlines that had been severed decades earlier. "What do we do?" Alva asked finally. Bjarke stood and helped her gather her healing stones, his mind already working through their options. "We do what we've always done. We face the truth together, and we decide what kind of future we want to build." But as they walked back toward the village, both of them knew that their quiet season of healing and growth was over. The world had found them, and it was demanding an accounting for the power they had accidentally claimed. The emergency clan meeting convened at sunset, the great hall packed with every warrior, elder, and family head in Vesterheim. Word of the Danish messenger's revelations had spread through the settlement like wildfire, and the atmosphere crackled with tension and uncertainty. Some faces showed fear, others excitement at the prospect of royal connections, but all reflected the understanding that their isolated clan was about to be thrust onto the stage of international politics. Elder Ragnar called for order, his staff striking the stone floor with sharp, commanding blows. When the hall finally quieted, he turned to Bjarke with an expression that mixed anger, concern, and something that might have been grudging respect. "The situation is clear," Ragnar began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Through circumstances none of us could have foreseen, our clan now holds a claim to the Danish throne. The question before us is simple. What do we do with this knowledge?" Astrid the Wise stood, her ancient frame somehow commanding, despite her small stature. "The question is not simple at all," she corrected. "We must consider not only what we want, but what our enemies will do to prevent us from having it. Royal blood makes one a target as much as it grants privilege." Eric Ironhand rose from his place among the warriors. "Prince Olaf asks for our aid in claiming his father's throne. If we support him, we might gain a powerful ally. If we refuse, we make an enemy of the future king of the Danes. Assuming he survives to claim that throne," muttered Thorvald the Grey, an old warrior whose scars spoke of decades of brutal experience. "Kings die young when too many people want their crown." Bjarke had remained silent throughout the debate, his massive hands resting on Thunder's edge as he listened to his people argue about his fate. Finally he stood, and the hall fell quiet. "There's something all of you need to understand," he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "This isn't really about Denmark or thrones or political alliances. This is about the fact that powerful men will kill my wife and me to eliminate a threat we never asked to become." He began walking slowly around the hall, making eye contact with clan members as he spoke. "Magnus the Cruel's advisors won't care whether we pursue our claim or renounce it. They'll see us as a future problem to be solved now, while we're still vulnerable. Our only real choice is whether we face this threat as victims or as warriors." Alva, who had been sitting quietly near the back of the hall, stood to address the assembly. The healing stones at her belt caught the firelight, and several clan members made protective gestures, not from fear of her, but from respect for the power they had witnessed her wield. "My husband speaks truly," she said, her clear voice carrying easily through the hall. "But there's more at stake here than just our lives. If we're killed, what happens to this clan? What happens to all of you?" The question hung in the air like a sword ready to fall. Everyone present understood the implications. Bjarke was not just their greatest warrior. He was their leader, their protector, their symbol of strength. If he died, especially if he died fleeing from enemies, the clan's reputation would never recover. "Magnus Iron Leg will return," Alva continued. "He'll bring others with him. Jarls who see opportunity in our weakness, men who think they can carve up our territory once Bjarke is gone. Our choice isn't really between supporting Prince Olaf or staying neutral. Our choice is between fighting for our survival on our own terms or waiting to be destroyed on someone else's." Young Halfdan, barely 20 but already showing promise as a warrior, spoke up from near the doors. "What would you have us do?" March on Denmark with our handful of fighters against King Magnus's entire army. Bjarke smiled grimly. No, Halfdan. They would have us think like Vikings, not like conventional warriors. We don't meet our enemies' strength with strength. We turn their strengths against them. He moved to the great hearth and picked up a piece of charcoal, then began sketching on the smooth stones of the fireplace around. His drawing showed the coastlines of Denmark and southern Norway, with strategic positions marked. King Magnus is dying, Bjarke explained as he drew. His kingdom is already fracturing as different factions position themselves for the succession. Prince Olaf represents legitimacy, but he's young and lacks a strong military base. The advisors who want us dead are the same ones trying to install a puppet ruler they can control. And we fit into this how? Asked Eric Ironhand. We become the force that tips the balance. Bjarke's charcoal moved across the stone, marking positions and movements. A small, mobile force of elite warriors can accomplish what a large army cannot. We strike quickly, eliminate key targets, and withdraw before anyone can respond. We don't try to conquer Denmark. We destabilize it enough that Prince Olaf can claim power with minimal resistance. Astrid the Wise studied the crude map with interest. You're proposing to assassinate the advisors before they can move against us. I'm proposing that we take control of our own fate instead of waiting for someone else to decide it for us. The debate that followed was intense but brief. The clan members were warriors first, and they understood the logic of striking first when facing inevitable conflict. By the time the moon reached its zenith, the decision was made. They would support Prince Olaf's claim to the Danish throne, but on their own terms and for their own reasons. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Weapons were sharpened, armor repaired, supplies gathered. But this would not be a traditional raiding party. Instead of overwhelming force, they would rely on stealth, speed, and intimate knowledge of their enemy's weaknesses. Alva threw herself into the preparations with an intensity that surprised even Bjarke. She worked late into each night, preparing medicines and poultices for the wounded, mixing poisons that could kill silently, blessing weapons with protective runes that drew on traditions older than Christianity. You don't have to do this, Bjarke told her one evening as she ground herbs by lamplight. You could stay here, keep the clan safe while we're gone. She looked up from her work, and in her green eyes he saw a determination that matched his own. They want to kill me as much as they want to kill you. My royal blood makes me just as dangerous to their plans. Besides, she returned to her grinding with renewed vigor. I have skills that might prove useful. Healing and harming often require the same knowledge, just applied differently. The night before their departure, they returned to the ancient shrine one last time. The spring air was warm enough that they didn't need heavy cloaks, and the forest around them hummed with new life. Birds called from the branches overhead, and wildflowers carpeted the ground between the massive pine trunks. Alva arranged her healing stones in the pattern she had used to divine their fate months earlier. But this time, the stones seemed to glow with a different kind of energy. The black obsidian at the center pulsed like a heartbeat, its silver veins catching starlight that filtered through the canopy. What do you see? Bjarke asked as she studied the pattern. Change, she said simply. Great change, coming faster than we expect. But also, she picked up one of the smaller stones, a piece of green jade carved with protective symbols. I hope, whatever happens in Denmark, it won't be the ending we feared. And us. What happens to us? Alva was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the carved spirals on the ancient altar. We become what we were always meant to be. Not the children who were separated by family politics, not the adults who were forced together by clan law, but the people we choose to become together. They made love for the first time that night. There in the sacred grove, with starlight falling through the branches and the ancient stones bearing witness. It was not the desperate passion of lovers who might never see each other again, but something deeper and more meaningful, the joining of two souls who had found their way back to each other through 20 years of separation and months of careful healing. When dawn broke, they walked back to the village hand in hand, ready to face whatever the world would demand of them. Their time of peace and growth was over, but they faced the future as they had learned to face everything else, together, as partners, as family, as two halves of a whole that had finally been made complete. The longships were waiting at the dock. Their dragon prows pointed toward Denmark and destiny. The Danish coast appeared through morning mist like something from a fever dream. Dark cliffs crowned with fortress walls, smoke rising from countless hearth fires, and the great port city of Hedeby sprawling along the shoreline like a living thing. From their position 2 miles offshore, Bjarke could see the royal banners flying from the palace towers, but he could also see the black smoke that marked burned buildings in the lower city. Civil war had already begun. Their approach had been carefully planned. Instead of the traditional longships that would mark them as Norwegian raiders, they sailed in 2 Danish merchant vessels that Erik Ironhand had captured months earlier. The disguise would allow them to enter Hedeby's harbour without immediate suspicion, buying precious time before their enemies could respond. Alva stood beside Bjarke at the bow, her healing stones arranged in a protective pattern around her belt. She had painted protective runes on her arms in woad and ash, markings that would be invisible unless someone knew what to look for. Her knowledge of poisons and healing had already proved invaluable during their 3-day voyage. She had prepared enough toxic compounds to eliminate a dozen men without leaving obvious evidence. "The palace is there," she said, pointing to the largest structure visible on the hill above the city. According to Prince Olaf's message, his father should be in the East Tower, guarded by men loyal to the royal line. The advisors who want us dead will be in the Great Hall, planning their next moves. Erik Ironhand approached from where he had been checking their warriors' weapons one final time. 23 men had volunteered for this mission. Not the clan's full strength, but the most skilled and experienced fighters they could muster. Each had been chosen for specific abilities: stealth, archery, close combat, or specialized knowledge that might prove useful in an urban environment. "The harbor guards are waving us in," Erik reported. "Our merchant disguise is holding so far." Bjarke nodded, his hand resting automatically on Thunder's edge. The legendary battle axe had been concealed beneath a merchant's cloak, but he could feel its weight against his leg like a promise of violence to come. "Remember the plan," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach his warriors. "We're not here to conquer Denmark or claim thrones through force. We're here to eliminate specific threats and ensure that Prince Olaf can claim power peacefully. Quick, clean strikes, then withdrawal to the ships. And if things go badly, us Thorvald the Grey, then we fight our way out and let the Danes settle their own succession." The harbour was chaos. Merchant ships crowded the docks, their crews unloading goods while keeping nervous eyes on the armed men who patrolled the waterfront. Royal guards in Danish colours moved through the crowds, clearly searching for something or someone. The smell of smoke and fear hung heavy in the salt air. As their ships manoeuvred toward an empty berth, Alva gripped Bjarke's arm. "Something's wrong. Look at the palace." New banners were flying from the highest tower, not the royal colours of King Magnus, but the personal heraldry of his chief advisor, Earl Godwin the Ambitious. Even from this distance, the message was clear. The old king was either dead or no longer in control. "We're too late," Erik muttered. "No," Bjarke said grimly. "We're exactly on time. If Godwin has moved openly against the crown, then Prince Olaf is in immediate danger. This ends today, one way or another." They disembarked quickly, leaving half their force to guard the ships while the rest melted into the crowded streets of Hedeby. Bjarke's size made stealth impossible, but Alva had anticipated this problem. She produced a bottle of dark liquid from her supplies and handed it to him. "Drink this. It won't change your height, but it will alter your coloring enough that casual observers won't recognize you immediately." The mixture tasted like bitter herbs and iron, but within minutes Bjarke could feel his hair darkening, his beard taking on a black sheen that transformed his appearance dramatically. Combined with the merchant's robes and a pronounced limp that disguised his natural stride, the effect was surprisingly convincing. They made their way through the lower city in small groups, avoiding the main thoroughfares where royal guards were conducting systematic searches. The narrow alleys and side streets were thick with refugees fleeing the political upheaval, and it was easy to blend in with the general chaos. Alva had studied maps of Hedeby for days, memorizing not just the major streets, but the network of service tunnels and forgotten passages that connected the older buildings. Her knowledge of the city's hidden geography would be crucial if they needed to move unseen or escape quickly. As they climbed toward the palace district, the evidence of civil conflict became more obvious. Burned shops, bloodstains on cobblestones, and the occasional body that hadn't yet been cleared away. Earl Godwin's supporters were making their move with brutal efficiency, eliminating anyone who might oppose their seizure of power. "There," Alva whispered, pointing toward a side entrance to the palace complex. "Prince Olaf said his loyal guards would be watching for us from the postern gate. If we can reach him before Godwin's men find him." Her words were cut short by the sound of marching feet echoing off the stone walls around them. A full company of Danish soldiers was approaching, their armor bright in the morning sun, their weapons already drawn. They had been discovered. The confrontation erupted with brutal suddenness. The Danish soldiers rounded the corner at a run, their captain shouting orders to surround the Norwegian infiltrators. But Bjarke and his warriors had not survived countless battles by waiting for their enemies to dictate the terms of engagement. Now, Bjarke roared, throwing off his merchant's disguise as Thunder's Edge sang from its sheath. The narrow alley became a killing ground. The Danish soldiers had expected to capture a small group of spies, not face elite Viking warriors in close quarters. Bjarke's massive frame filled the width of the passage, his star-metal blade carving through armor and flesh with devastating efficiency. Behind him, his men formed a wedge that drove forward like the prow of a longship cutting through waves. But numbers mattered, and more soldiers were arriving every moment. The sound of battle echoed off the stone walls, drawing reinforcements from all directions. What had been planned as a stealth mission was rapidly becoming a pitched battle in the streets of Hedeby. Alva pressed herself against the wall, her hands working quickly to prepare one of her most potent weapons. From her leather pouch, she withdrew a ceramic vial filled with liquid that glowed with sickly green phosphorescence. The compound was her own creation, a mixture of exotic fungi and distilled toxins that would kill within minutes of contact with exposed skin. "Bjarke," she called, holding up the vial. "Clear the passage." He understood immediately. Thunder's Edge swept in a great arc that drove the nearest enemies back, creating a momentary gap in their ranks. Alva hurled the ceramic container with deadly accuracy, watching it shatter against the captain's chest armor. The phosphorescent liquid splashed across half a dozen soldiers, and within seconds they began convulsing as the poison entered their bloodstream. The surviving Danes fell back in terror, some shouting warnings about witchcraft and sorcery. But their retreat was short-lived. The sound of marching feet from behind announced the arrival of Earl Godwin's elite guard, heavily armored warriors who would not be intimidated by poison or reputation. "The palace!" Eric Ironhand shouted over the din of battle. "We have to reach Prince Olaf before they surround us completely." They fought their way up the steep street toward the palace gates, leaving bodies in their wake but taking casualties of their own. Young Halfdan fell with a crossbow bolt through his shoulder, and Thorvald the Grey was bleeding from a sword cut that ran from his temple to his jaw. They were running out of time and options. The palace courtyard opened before them, like an arena designed for their destruction. Earl Godwin's forces had anticipated their approach, positioning archers on the walls and spearmen at every entrance. In the center of the courtyard, a gallows had been hastily constructed, and Prince Olaf hung from it by his wrists, barely conscious but still alive. "A trap," Eric muttered. "Of course it's a trap," Bjarke replied grimly. "The question is whether we're strong enough to break it." Earl Godwin himself appeared on the palace steps, resplendent in royal regalia that he had no right to wear. He was a thin man with calculating eyes and the soft hands of someone who had never held a weapon in honest combat. Behind him stood a dozen advisors and courtiers, all complicit in the coup that had seized control of Denmark. Bjarke the Thunderborn. Godwin's voice carried clearly across the courtyard. You arrived just in time to witness the end of the old royal line. Prince Olaf dies at sunset, and with him, any claim you might have made to interfere in Danish affairs. Release the prince, and we'll consider leaving you alive, Bjarke called back. Godwin laughed, a cold sound that echoed off the stone walls. You're hardly in a position to make demands. Surrender now, and I might grant you and your wife quick deaths. Continue this foolishness, and I'll make sure you both die slowly enough to regret every choice that brought you here. But Alva was no longer listening to the threats and posturing. Her attention was focused on something else entirely. The ancient stone beneath their feet, the same type of carved granite that surrounded the sacred shrine in their Norwegian forest. The symbols were different, worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic. But the power they contained was unmistakable. She knelt and pressed her palms against the carved stones, feeling the thrumming energy that connected this place to every sacred site across the Nordic lands. Her grandmother's ring, Solveig's ring, began to glow within a fire, resonating with the ancient magic that still flowed beneath Denmark's royal palace. Bjarke, she whispered urgently. This courtyard, it's built on an old sacred site. The same type as our shrine, but much older, much more powerful. If I can channel that energy, she didn't need to finish the thought. He understood, and more importantly, he trusted her completely. Do it, he said, raising Thunder's edge high above his head. Whatever you need, I'll buy you the time. The final battle was about to begin. What happened next would be remembered in Danish and Norwegian sagas for generations to come. Alva's connection to the ancient sacred site beneath the palace courtyard released energies that had been dormant for centuries. The carved stones began to glow with ethereal light, and the very air crackled with power that made every warrior present feel the presence of the old gods. Earl Godwin's archers found their bowstrings snapping without cause, their arrows falling harmlessly to the ground as if the air itself had grown thick as water. The spearmen's weapons became too heavy to lift, and several of the courtiers collapsed to their knees as visions of Denmark's true royal lineage flooded their minds. But it was Bjarke who provided the decisive moment. As Alva channeled the ancient power through her grandmother's ring, he charged across the courtyard with Thunder's edge blazing like captured lightning. The star-metal blade cut through Earl Godwin's elite guards as if they were made of parchment, and his war cry shook the palace walls until stones fell from the battlements. The false Earl himself fell before he could draw his sword, Thunder's edge taking his head in a single stroke that sent it rolling across the glowing stones of the courtyard. His death broke the spell that held the Danish court in thrall to his ambitions, and suddenly Prince Olaf's loyal supporters were emerging from hidden corners, their swords singing as they moved against the remaining conspirators. The coup collapsed in minutes. Without Godwin's charismatic leadership and with the ancient magic revealing the truth of royal bloodlines, the usurpers found themselves abandoned by followers who suddenly remembered where their true loyalties lay. Prince Olaf was freed from the gallows, more dead than alive. But Alva's healing skills proved equal to the task of saving him. As she worked over his battered body with her sacred stones and carefully prepared medicines, she whispered the old prayers that Signy had taught her, calling on powers older than Christianity to preserve a life that represented hope for two kingdoms. Will he live? Bjarke asked as he watched her work. He'll live, she replied with quiet confidence, and he'll rule well. The visions I saw when the stones awakened. He has the wisdom to be the king Denmark needs. The immediate crisis was over, but the larger questions remained. As Prince Olaf recovered his strength over the following days, he and Bjarke spent long hours discussing the future of Danish-Norwegian relations. The young prince was deeply grateful for the rescue, but he was also pragmatic enough to understand that two kingdoms could not share the same royal bloodline without eventual conflict. The solution they reached was as elegant as it was unprecedented. Bjarke and Alva would formally renounce any claim to the Danish throne, accepting instead the title of royal protectors, a position that granted them significant influence in Danish affairs while keeping them firmly based in their Norwegian homeland. In return, Prince Olaf would guarantee the independence of Vesterheim and provide military support if their clan was ever threatened. But more importantly, their marriage would be recognized as legitimate and blessed by both kingdoms. What had begun as punishment imposed by clan law would be transformed into a diplomatic alliance that strengthened bonds between former enemies. The journey back to Norway took place in autumn, when the leaves were turning gold and the first frost was beginning to touch the mountain peaks. Bjarke and Alva stood together at the bow of their longship, watching the familiar coastline of Vesterheim grow larger on the horizon. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Alva asked as seabirds wheeled around their mast. "We could have claimed the Danish throne. We could have ruled over 2 kingdoms." Bjarke considered her question as he watched the smoke rising from their village hearths. Ruling kingdoms means spending your life in great halls, surrounded by courtiers and constantly watching for threats from rivals. "I'd rather spend mine in a small house by a forge, married to a woman who knows how to make healing tea and can channel the power of ancient gods when the situation requires it." She smiled at that, the first truly joyous expression he had seen on her face since the crisis began. "Besides, can you imagine what Sinji would say if I came back claiming to be a queen? She'd probably make me spend a month grinding herbs as punishment for getting above myself." They found their village preparing for the winter season, with grain stores being sealed and livestock brought down from the high pastures. But the moment their longship was spotted in the fjord, the entire population gathered on the shore to welcome them home. Elder Ragnar was the first to speak when they disembarked. His weathered face creased with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "So," he said, "you've managed to turn your punishment marriage into a diplomatic alliance with a foreign kingdom. I suppose that's one way to redeem your reputation." "The marriage was never the punishment," Bjarke replied, putting his arm around Alva's shoulders. "The punishment was the 20 years we spent apart, thinking that family bonds could be broken by anger and pride." That evening, the Great Hall hosted a feast unlike any in the clan's history. Stories were told of their adventures in Denmark, toasts were raised to their new alliance with Prince Olaf, and songs were sung, celebrating the love that had grown from the ashes of old family wounds. As the celebration wound down, Bjarke and Alva walked hand in hand to their small house behind the forge. It was the same modest dwelling they had been assigned as newly married strangers, but it felt different now, not like a prison or a punishment, but like home. Later that night, as they lay by their fire listening to the wind in the rafters, Alva spoke the words that would define the rest of their life together. "We found our way back to each other, despite everything that tried to keep us apart. That's worth more than any crown, don't you think?" Bjarke pulled her closer, feeling the peaceful certainty that comes when a man knows he's exactly where he belongs. "Much more," he agreed, and closed his eyes to dream of the future they would build together, not as king and queen, but as husband and wife, brother and sister, 2 souls who had learned that the greatest treasures are often disguised as the heaviest burdens. Sometimes the worst punishment really does become the greatest blessing. And sometimes the family we choose proves stronger than the family we're born into.